In this video, I'm going to attempt to answer the question of whether or not an electric vehicle in rural America makes any sense in 2025. Welcome to Pragmatic. This is a place where I talk about topics that I have experience and interest in and try to give a pragmatic view. It seems like in today's world of social media and TikTok and Instagram and YouTube and all these outlets that everyone has an ability to share their opinion. And by and large, this is a great thing, but many times what happens is individuals share their opinions based on either a position of extreme bias or sometimes from hearsay where they really don't have any experience in the matter. So what I'm going to try to do is talk about EV ownership in rural America in 2025. I started this journey of EV ownership in 2019, and I wasn't coming from a position of political motivation or even environmental motivation. I really started to ask myself, what are the expenses in my middle age that I can begin to take care of in the present time that I won't have to deal as much with in the future? And this journey really started with assessing and ultimately deciding to put solar on our residence and on our property here. To fast forward, I put the solar in, and after I realized just how relevant it was, even in a state that is not considered a sunny state, I immediately had the next thought, what else can I plug in? And really the biggest expense I had outside of the housing costs are transportation. Now for me, I come from a background where we always drove and purchased used cars, and so overcoming the initial purchase price of a new vehicle for me was a big hurdle. But as I began to play out the math in this spreadsheet where I analyzed existing cost and depreciation and operating expense, it started to make sense, especially when considering the cost of electricity. Now I mentioned that I have solar on the house, but I'm going to talk about this from the standpoint of just purchasing electric, because I realize not everybody has solar or has the ability to put it in, and so I'm going to address these matters as though I was just plugging in and paying the prevailing utility rate, which here in West Virginia is basically in the national average. The service provider we have is a co-op, and so it's more expensive than the larger energy provider here in the region, but nevertheless it averages between the two providers, it averages about 12 to 13 cents per kilowatt. Now, owning an EV is a very nuanced topic. There's a lot of factors that affect the decision, and everyone is in a different situation. And so I think to really be pragmatic about this approach, what we have to do is we have to define a few basic parameters. In other words, we have to put a few stakes in the ground. And if these stakes or these parameters don't represent you, then maybe this topic isn't even the right discussion for you. But I really feel that the majority of vehicle owners that are using their vehicle for transportation of people, either themselves or family, what have you, that these parameters really begin to define the majority. One is that your vehicle use does not exceed, on average, 150 miles per day. Now that doesn't mean you can never go beyond 150 miles. We commonly road trip in electric vehicles and in gas vehicles the same, but for the most part, the daily commute is 100 miles or less, and on occasion, in addition to going to work, there's a sporting event to go to in the evening, or some other extracurricular activity on the weekend that gets us out there and, generally speaking, gets us back home within about 150 miles. The second parameter that I'll go ahead and define is that this discussion really depends best upon the individual having access to electricity at their residence. And when I say access to, I would venture to say that most everybody in America has access to electricity inside their home, but this is really more about the charging of your vehicle. So if you're living in an apartment complex and you don't have a plug someplace, then maybe not best for you. But there again, because I'm talking about the topic specifically of living in rural America, I'm going to assume that most people in rural America are not living in an apartment complex. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I want to make this video. You know, I benefited greatly in my initial research from channels like Ben Solins and Andy Sly and others who made Tesla videos, and they do a great job. But a lot of times these creators are talking about scenarios, or at least living in scenarios where they're in very densely populated areas, and the demographic is quite a bit different in rural America than it is in the urban settings. A third basic parameter that I'm going to go ahead and define for this discussion is that your uses for a vehicle are in the what I'll call the norm. I realize there are a lot of people who use trucks for towing, and they'll love to, you know, comment about videos like this and say that would never work for me. And I realize that. I have a diesel pickup truck for heavy work that I do. I only drive it a few thousand miles a year, but the things I use it for, the electric vehicles on the market presently, and certainly the electric cars on the market, will not satisfy that need. And so if that's you, again, this topic is probably not for you. But for the most people, owning a vehicle for personal transportation, driving less than 150 miles round trip, you know, a day as kind of a general average or less, and not having some super special use case that really doesn't define the majority, that's kind of the basic framework that we're going to use for this discussion. I actually tow with this vehicle quite a bit. I'll pop up a few photos, but we have a boat that we commonly go out on in the summertime. It's right at the tow limit of this vehicle of 3,500 pounds gross trailer weight and 500 pounds of tongue weight. And this thing is a beast. It does excellent with it. Now, you will take a pretty significant range hit of about 50% when you tow at this kind of capacity. But there again, unless you're towing a long distance and unless you're having to find a charging stop somewhere in between, it's a complete non-factor, because you're going to enjoy your time on the boat, you're going to return home and plug the vehicle back in just like you normally would. I also tow a slightly lighter trailer that I carry a mower on. I used to do this with my truck. I would load the mower up on the truck and take it, and then it just kind of occurred to me that this truck gets 14 miles per gallon. It's a diesel pickup truck. It literally costs 30 cents per mile in fuel to drive this truck, and my car costs 3 cents a mile in electric use. So let's start with the topic of charging. Okay, so this has been covered in a lot of videos, but the most efficient and most practical way to charge an electric vehicle of any kind is at your residence. And so whether you're using a 110 volt outlet or a 220 or a Tesla wall charger, you know, any of these will work, but the basic reality is that most people should and do charge at their residence, and they charge overnight. And you know, when people's opinions gravitate towards the supercharging locations or road tripping and begin to define the daily driving experience from that standpoint, I think they kind of miss the point of what the normal, average, daily, and very regular use of an electric vehicle or a vehicle of any kind really is. And so from a practical standpoint, when I arrive home at night, I drive about 80 miles a day, round trip commute. When I arrive home in the evening, you know, I generally use about 30 to 35% of the battery capacity. So I kind of charge to 80%, and you know, so I get home with about 45 to 50%. We use a Tesla wall charger here, which puts approximately 45 miles of range back in the battery per hour of charge. And so for my scenario, somewhere just under 2 hours brings the car back to a full charge. Now, in my particular case here, my wife and I both drive Model Ys, and so we both charge off of the same charging plug. And so whoever gets home first, we just plug that car in, and sometime before bed, we plug the other one in. But even in the case that you don't have that wall charger, which is the fastest level 2 charger that you can have at your house, typically speaking, if you're just charging off of a 110 volt plug, that puts only 5 miles of range per hour of charge into your vehicle, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it's not a lot. However, I would go back to my use case scenario and say I drive 80 miles a day. I arrive back home, between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. I effectively have 14 hours before I need the use of my car again. And so when you do that math, what you quickly find out is that you basically can put that exact amount of miles back in the car, even on that 110 volt plug. And I know that in my particular case, I drive more miles a day than most people I know. So charging at home is absolutely the most convenient, most practical, the cheapest. It just makes the most sense. And so when videos and people talk about charging on the road, I would encourage people who are considering an electric vehicle in 2025 to not put too much weight on that particular consideration, because you're going to charge primarily at home. That's just what makes the most sense. Another valid point of discussion is maintenance and service. And it is true that electric vehicles require far less scheduled and regular maintenance than ICE vehicles or gas-powered vehicles. And honestly, if you're still on the fence about that, you really need to just let go of that discussion. There's so much empirical evidence now, real world use case scenarios that prove that electric vehicles have far less maintenance requirements than ICE vehicles. They're just a much more simple machine, far fewer moving parts. And I know that there are cases out there where someone has had a lemon or a terrible experience and they've had way more maintenance than their ICE vehicle that they had before. But I'm here to tell you that there's just as many people on the other side of that equation. In fact, more so. And I bought a gas car, it was a brand new car, and it needed all this work. That's anecdotal type stories, and again, not a very pragmatic view of the reality out there. So believe the truth of the fact that an electric vehicle is cheaper to regularly maintain. However, I do want to point out that, at least as it relates to Teslas, which still at this point in 2025 are the most prolific electric vehicle out there in the US and maybe even around the world, the majority, well, all of the Tesla service centers are in more metropolitan areas. And so, for instance, we live 2 hours away from the closest Tesla service center. And so when we do need maintenance, it's kind of an ordeal. And I'm not going to gloss over that reality. Now, we've been a 2 Tesla family since 2020. I bought my first one in 2019, and we quickly bought the second one and replaced our other gas vehicle. And we average about 1 trip a year to the service center between the 2 vehicles. And to be fair, one of those trips was a busted windshield. Nothing to do with it being a Tesla. It's just I had only had the car for a couple years, and I really wanted to make sure that it was installed correctly, and I wasn't sure that the glass shops around where I live had any experience, and so I chose to take it to Tesla. Now, consequently, I had a second broken windshield in that same vehicle a few years later, and I took it to a local glass shop, and they did fine with it. And so, some of these trips are probably unnecessary, but some of them have been necessary to take it to Tesla. But on average, it's about 1 a year has been our experience. And you need to consider that if you're a day's drive away from a Tesla service center and something, although rare, does happen, it's going to cost you a day of your time. And so do consider that as a real possibility, however unlikely and out of the norm. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the dreaded road trip. It's the thing that everyone fears with an electric vehicle. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. After 5 years of ownership and now I think 240,000 miles between the two of us in our regular driving, and having no other passenger vehicle that is a gas vehicle, we have lots of road trip experience in our Teslas. We've always had Model 3 or Model Ys. They both had about 300-mile range, and we live in a pretty rural part of the state. And so the reality about road tripping is, in 2025, there is a Tesla supercharger on pretty much every major highway about every 50 to 70 miles. now. And there are exceptions once again, and in fact, where we live, if we go north, west, or south from here, we can be at a supercharger in less than 50 miles in any direction, and in some cases within 15 miles. However, if we go east, which crosses over the mountains towards Virginia, there's not a really good supercharger option until you get really into Virginia, or maybe up along the I-68 corridor into Maryland. And so this becomes kind of a topic that you need to consider. However, if you know in advance that you're going, if you charge to a, near full or 100%, it's never a problem. In fact, there have been many cases where we depart out of here with the intended plan to stop, shortly after our departure so that we can get dinner on the road as we head to the beach or whatever our scenario is. At this point, I've had this car on 1,600-mile road trips. I just recently had it in the mountains of western North Carolina. Once again, a place that doesn't have a lot of superchargers, but no problem at all getting there and back. In fact, that particular trip, which was about 360 miles, was a one-stop charge in southern West Virginia. We drove for three and a half hours, stopped, got something to eat, let it fully charge when we were there, finished the drive, and got to our destination with, I think 17% battery life left. So plenty of capability on the road trip. And once again, I want to point out that just because you make a road trip every now and then doesn't mean that that's your day-to-day. You're not going to have to deal with road trip charging in that kind of frequency. And for us, and we're a pretty active family, we might road trip once a month, and so for the most part it's again a non-issue. There's a lot of videos out there where folks have compared the direct operating costs between an electric vehicle and an ICE vehicle, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about that, but I'll just say, generally speaking, we don't spend any more money on tires, we don't spend any more money on insurance, we certainly don't spend any more money on regular maintenance items, because there's just none basically to talk of. But I did want to speak specifically about purchase price. And this story is constantly changing, but if you watch any content at all on electric vehicles, there's a significant chance that you're going to hear the opinion that an electric vehicle costs more than the ICE equivalent. And I think here in 2025, this is another topic that we just need to put to rest, okay? There are certainly electric vehicles that cost more than other types of ICE vehicles. But when we compare apples to apples, same vehicle to same vehicle, new to new, we're really talking about price parity or even cheaper on the side of the EV. I think as I'm recording this in 2025, I think the average new car price in America is about $48,000 now. That's just the average new vehicle price. This Model Y right now can be bought for $41,000, and that's with the $7,500 tax credit, which may go away later this year, but that's the new version that was just launched earlier this year. The 2024 Model Y that we purchased in March of 2024, we were out the door, all-wheel drive, brand new vehicle, out the door $38,000. I mean, that's not more expensive than any other equivalent vehicle to the all-wheel drive Model Y. And so I think people need to understand that, in the early days of electric vehicles, and certainly when the Tesla Model S was the only one really out there, and they were $100,000, and you were comparing them to some other kind of full-size sedan, yeah, it was more expensive, but those days are gone. Even in the case of the electric trucks that are out there now, and there's not nearly as many of them, but if you spec a gas truck, a Ford F-150 or a Chevy Silverado or a GMC Sierra, Denali package, whatever it is, if you spec them out the same, you're going to be looking at a very similar price parity. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. I hope that the information has been informative. Again, I try to present topics from a very pragmatic view, without the hype, without any kind of bias or motivation, just based off the experience that I and my family have had. And in this particular case, I would give a resounding recommendation to the majority of American drivers, especially those living in rural areas of the country, to have an electric vehicle. It's just a good economic option for your daily driving needs. And I think that especially if you're driving in the 10,000 to 25 or 30,000 mile a year range, I think you're really missing an opportunity to save some legitimate money in your transportation costs. And something I haven't even talked about, but I'll just mention here in closing, is that the Tesla vehicle specifically, and I know I probably sound very biased towards Tesla, it's just where my experience is, but they are and happen to be the safest tested vehicles on the road. And it's not that I wake up in the morning planning on totaling my vehicle, but with family members in the car and doing as much driving as I do on a daily basis, there's a little bit of peace of mind knowing that if I do have the misfortune of being in an accident, whether I'm at fault or not, I'm driving a very safe vehicle. And I've driven a lot of vehicles over the years that could certainly not be characterized that way. So thanks for tuning in and listening to my views on electric vehicle ownership in rural America in 2025. If you've got any questions or thoughts, feel free to leave them down in the comments. And if you like this type of content, let me know in the comments and I'll try to produce some more for you.